Alright guys, today we're going to be taking a look at the PC performance for Tom Clancy's Ghost Recon Wildlands, which is available now at the time of me making this video, March 7th, 2017. We're going to be testing in two different PCs. We got a Ryzen setup as well as an Intel Kaby Lake system, and we're going to be utilizing three graphics cards in each of those systems. We'll start off by going through all of the graphics options available in the game, as well as which settings we were using for our benchmark testing. But starting off with the systems, the Ryzen build with the 1700 is paired up with 16 gigabytes of DDR4 memory, and that CPU is overclocked to 3.9 gigahertz, while over on the Kaby Lake build that also has 16 gigabytes of DDR4 memory, but that one is overclocked to 5 gigahertz. So we've got both of these CPUs pushed to the highest stable OC that I was able to get them to, and our graphics cards for testing were overclocked as well and running on their latest drivers. So on the AMD side, for the RX 480, the driver was 17.3.1, and that RX 480 was pushed up to 1400 megahertz, I should say, on the core, and 2150 megahertz on the memory, while for the Nvidia GTX 1080 and the 1060, both of those cards had an additional 200 megahertz on the core and 300 megahertz on the memory, and were running on the latest driver for them, 378.66. I did actually check in with Nvidia to see if they were going to have a game-ready driver for today, but they said they weren't going to be releasing anything until the 1080 Ti launches on this Friday. So those are the latest drivers that we've got for both of these teams and the test systems that we are using. So now let's go ahead and jump into the graphics options and get a look at what's going on in there. So here we are now in the advanced graphics options menu, showing you the custom ultra settings that I used for my benchmarking, which was basically the ultra preset. The only changes being that I disabled motion blur and depth of field options, but everything else remained the same for any of my ultra testing. When I tested on our mid-tier cards with the RX 480 and the GTX 1060, I used the very high preset. Once again, the only changes being that I disabled depth of field and any motion blur options for our testing. Going through the options in here, we can see that we do have anti-aliasing. We have temporal AA or an FXA, or you can go ahead and disable it. We've got ambient occlusion, which you can run off with SSBC, which is Ubisoft's own form of in-house ambient occlusion. And we've also got NVIDIA's HBAO+. Draw distance, we've also got level of detail in here, texture quality, anisotropic filtering, shadow qualities, terrain, vegetation, turf effects, motion blur, iron sight depth of field, high quality depth of field. Once again, all of those three were off in our testing. We've also got bloom, God rays, subsurface scattering, lens flares, and finally, long range shadows rounds up the options menu. But enough looking at graphics options, let's jump into the side-by-side comparison of the RX 480 and the GTX 1060 running in our two different setups with the i7 7700K and the Ryzen 7 1700. This was all running on the 1080p very high preset with those depth of field and motion blur options disabled, which I went over in the graphics options overview. Here, what I think you'll be seeing is what will be echoed later on when we look at the graphs for the averages and the minimums, but we'll see that the GTX 1060 with the 7700K, it seems to be running the game the best out of all of the different configurations that we have here, and that was consistent throughout all of my testing, where it seemed to be that the game would run better on NVIDIA graphics cards when it came down to NVIDIA versus AMD, and when it came down to the processor side of things, it does appear to be running better and faster right now, at least, on the Kaby Lake i7 7700K than it is on the Ryzen 1700, despite all of these systems being overclocked and everything to their max stable OCs like we went over previously. Jumping into the graph here, we can see in the yellow, you'll be seeing the 1080p on very high, while the white graph is the 1080p Ultra preset with all of these graphics cards in the different systems here. And once again, you can see that the 1060 with the 7700K takes the lead as the best configuration at 1080p very high, getting an average of 66 FPS, and very high is the preset I would recommend most people out there to probably run at if you're trying to get a smooth 60 FPS in this game, or maybe even lower than that depending on what graphics card you're using. But if you're on something sort of modern, if you are struggling at Ultra, just try dropping it down to that very high preset and you'll probably get a nice boost in performance, as you'll see here going across the board. The RX 480 with that Intel processor ended up getting an average of 60 FPS, so both graphics cards totally capable of powering this game on 1080p at very high with the Kaby Lake 7700K. It's only when we get to the Ryzen 1700 paired with the RX 480 do we see the averages dropping down below 60 with 57 on that very high preset. And a massive drop in performance going from very high to ultra. With the 1060 here at 7700K, we go from 66 all the way down to 43 FPS on the averages. The minimums also tell pretty much the same story. We've got the 53 here at the minimum on the GTX 1060 on 7700K. So that all of these cards with the different configurations, no matter what, even on the very high preset, did dip down below 60 FPS, but the one that was able to maintain the best frames consistently was the 1060 paired with that 7700K, getting only that minimum of 53. At 1080p and Ultra, that dropped all the way down to a minimum of 37, so you really be struggling to run this game if you try to run it at the Ultra preset with either of these graphics cards, no matter which processor you are pairing with it. So just be wary of that. If you are having performance issues, just try that very high preset, and you'll probably getting much better FPS. We'll switch over to the GTX 1080 now, where we got to see the 1080p as well as the 1440p Ultra averages. We see an average of 68 FPS with the 1080p on Ultra with the 7700K, while with the 1700 that drops down to 58 FPS on the averages. So a 10 FPS difference just by switching out the processor with the same settings and everything with the GTX 1080, while at 1440p, we got to see the average at 55 with the 7700K and 47 on the 1700. So once again, just like on the lower end cards, we can see that the 7700K rig is running better with the Nvidia hardware and also just better in general on the Kaby Lake processor versus Ryzen. So that also, we get to see the minimums as well again. 1440p at Ultra is really going to be a struggle, as you'll see in the averages and minimums. If you are wanting to run at 1440p, I would probably suggest you use the very high preset and then maybe you can go in there and probably tweak up a few options to Ultra. But the game seems to be utilizing the hardware very well, pushing everything to the highest that it possibly can, and getting decent FPS overall for what is a beautiful looking game, very graphically demanding. So I really don't have any issues necessarily with the performance, as long as you know what to expect out of it, being that it is a graphically demanding open world title which is going to use a lot of CPU resources. So just be aware of all of that going into this before you decide to pick up Ghost Recon Wildlands. If you want to pick it up, I'll leave a link down in the description below over to CD Keys. Just make sure that it is available for your region before purchasing. Sometimes they do have ones that are limited to just Europe, so just be aware of that and check on CD Keys before buying any games for yourself. Make sure it's available for your region specifically on the copy that you're buying, and you might be able to save a few bucks and support the channel in the process. But I'm going to go ahead and get on out of here. If you enjoyed this performance review of Ghost Recon Wildlands with the two setups and the graphics cards and all the different resolutions and settings, then don't forget to go ahead and leave us a like down below or subscribe if you're not already, and I'll catch you guys next time. Ta-ra.